Tom was nice enough to say that I'm a business school dean. Specifically, I'm the dean of the Eller College of Management at the University of Arizona. I'm also a professor of economics there. But I think I've been invited here today because prior to the 5 years that I've spent as dean at the University of Arizona, I worked in Washington, D.C. for a think tank, a research organization called Resources for the Future. The last 10 years as its president, Resources for the Future will be 60 years old in a couple of years, and it's dedicated to doing independent, nonpartisan, high-quality analysis on energy and environmental matters, and then sharing the results of the research with people in the environmental advocacy community, the business community, Republicans and Democrats in Congress, and trying to be an independent, high-quality source of information for people like you and people at the national level who have to make decisions on pressing and important energy and environmental issues. And Hunter Lovin said in her talk this morning how important it is that there be credible information that's available to policymakers. I don't have to say that to those of you who are state legislators. You know that. The trouble is that there are a million different sources of information, often conflicting information from equally credible sources. It's not like we can all agree on who ought to do the analysis, and once they do the analysis, everybody will buy into it. Research doesn't work out that well, and policy making is complicated for that reason. If you don't mind, I'm going to start with a story. More than 30 years ago, I taught economics at the University of California at Berkeley. And on one weekend, my wife and my two young kids went up to farther in Northern California for a little hike. A beautiful area, kind of golden hills, live oaks. We're walking along in sort of a country road, and we came across a shepherd, a farmer with a huge flock of sheep. And we had to wait for this flock of sheep to cross in front of us, and so I kind of looked at the shepherd and I looked at the sheep and I said, "Hey, are you a sporting man?" And he said, "Well, sure." And I said, "If I could guess the exact number of sheep in your flock, would you give me one of them?" And the guy looked at me quizzically, and my wife looked at me even more quizzically, but he had so many sheep, I know he thought I could never guess, so he said, "Sure." So I kind of looked at the number of sheep in about a 20 square foot section, counted them quickly, estimated how many similar 20-foot sections there were, and I said, "I think you've got 980 sheep." And the guy looked as if he had been poleaxed. I mean, he was absolutely stunned. And he said, "That's truly remarkable. That's exactly how many sheep I have. You've won." So I picked up one of the animals, put it under my arm, and I started down the road with my family. This guy looked at me and said, "Well, just a minute." He said, Are you a sporting man?" I said, "Well, sure." He said, "Would you give me a chance to win that back?" And I said, "Okay, how would we do it?" He said, "Suppose I can guess your profession." Now I had on blue jeans, a tennis shirt, sweatshirt with no markings. So I said, "Well, sure." He said, "I'll bet you're an academic, probably a college professor, and I'll bet you're on leave from one of those think tanks in Washington, D.C. Now I was flabbergasted. I said, "That's unbelievable. How did you know?" He said, "As soon as you put my dog down, I'll tell you." So I'm a little worried that that's the view that you have of people like me. But nevertheless, I kind of want to talk about environmental policy making in the United States. This is going to be a different talk. First of all, I don't have a PowerPoint. I'm too old to have mastered it at that point in my life when I could have learned it easily, and so a PowerPoint for me comes when I put my speaking notes on top of a laptop. That's kind of as high-tech as I get. But if you want to sort of think of a good working and homely title for this talk, it would be "There's More Than One Way to Skin a Cat." And I've always used that saying because I grew up with dogs. Now, at my wife's insistence, I have 2 cats, and I'm a little less comfortable saying something like that. But at any rate, if you sort of want to accomplish an environmental objective, it could be climate, reducing CO2 emissions. It could be more traditional environmental goals like reducing water pollution or sulfur dioxide or particulate emissions from a coal plant, nitrogen oxide emissions from a gas plant, whatever it is. There are sort of a variety of tools that we can use. One of them that John Byrne talked about earlier today is public-private partnerships. That's one way you can try to do this. You could also do this through what I call a combination of information provision and moral suasion. That is, you sort of educate the public about the nature of the problem. You give them data about why it's a serious problem and why they ought to care about it. And tell them the right thing to do is this. You've armed them with information, and then you kind of hope that they voluntarily reduce emissions, and that's the kind of thing that my friend Charlie Kolstad will talk about after me. A third way you could do this is through regulation. The government can say that every coal-fired power plant has to do this, steel plants have to do that, cars have to be controlled in this way. Economists like me, and I plead guilty to being that sort of cartoon character of an economist that Hunter portrayed today, economists like me sometimes call this command and control regulation because it's the government not only specifying a goal but telling the sources of the pollutant, here are the things that each of you has to do in order to reduce pollution. I'm here to talk about a fourth alternative to this, and before I do, I want to make a political comment that has to do with this question of information and provision and what I call moral suasion. I think one of the challenges that we face in the climate debate today is that the Clinton administration and now the Obama administration has come into office believing that this is a very serious problem, climate change, as I do myself, but then proceeding to sort of negotiate with elites both within the country and with other foreign governments without making a significant effort to educate the American public about what this problem is. This is not a political slam on my part. My 2 years in government came in 1979 and 1980 when I worked at the White House in the Carter administration. So I consider myself a Democrat and pretty much always have, although like many Democrats, I spend a lot of time wondering why I am this way. But, and all you guys who laugh because you're Republicans, you ought to be thinking the same thing. Why? At any rate, if we're going to move the needle on climate change or these other environmental issues using any of the four approaches that I talked about, and certainly the one that I'm going to talk the most about, the first step is to convince people that this is something that they need to take seriously. And I don't think any administration, Republican or Democrat, has invested the time and effort to make people understand the dimensions of this problem and why they should be willing to sacrifice. Because doing something about the climate change problem, indeed doing things about other more pedestrian environmental problems, generally involves some economic sacrifice. We're going to have to do that if we expect to move anywhere at all on this issue, in my view. So what I want to talk about are called economic incentive-based approaches to environmental policy, and the premise is really simple. It's using the market in the service of the environment. It is not an alternative to regulation. Incentive-based regulation is just a different form of regulation where instead of telling individual sources of pollutants, you've got to install this type of control equipment, you have to do this, you have to do this, you create an economic incentive that motivates them to act. Okay? It's that simple. It's putting the free market and using the principles that have made the free market such a powerful instrument in enriching this country and other countries that rely on the market mostly for organizing their economic organization. It puts that market notion in the service of the environment. But you do it, it doesn't happen by leaving it up to the public. You have to take regulatory action to create the preconditions for an incentive-based approach. But that's the idea. Let's use the market to get people to economize on pollution The same way they economize on labor because they have to pay each person that they hire. They economize on capital because they have to borrow money in capital markets and it costs them money. They economize on raw materials because they have to pay for raw materials. The idea is if they have to pay for the amount of pollution that they discharge, they're going to find ways not to pollute to cut down on their costs. So it's making pollution a factor of production that people have to pay for, and thus giving rise to that sort of entrepreneurial incentive and power that Hunter Lovins talked about earlier. That's the idea behind this incentive-based approach. Now, I'm going to talk about 3 different types of incentives. I feel terribly about not being more high-tech. So I've done my introduction. You can see that's here. Now I've talked about the 4 techniques. Now I've moved to economic incentives. So the first one I'll talk about right there you can see is a subsidy. Now this you're all familiar with. And we've talked about the subsidy earlier today. We've talked about state actions on energy conservation, on wind, on solar, on geothermal, a whole host of things states are doing, and they're doing it by subsidies. Well, a subsidy is an economic incentive. It makes it cheaper to build a solar plant to put rooftop solar on individuals' homes than it would be otherwise. So that's one form of an economic incentive-based approach. One of the challenges is that when we talk about solar or geothermal or wind or other non-carbon alternatives to electricity generation or in other industrial processes, we've sort of gotten in the habit of saying in California it's competitive, in Arizona it's competitive, someplace else it's competitive. Often it's competitive after all these subsidies. It's competitive to the consumer. But what you really have to look at is, and as state legislators, you're mindful of the fact that every subsidy that you give is a tax dollar that you no longer collect. And you have to take into account those lost revenues as part of the cost of the overall package. Now, I believe in these subsidies. I believe in government R&D to buy down the cost of solar and wind. But we can't kid ourselves when we say, because to a business that installs a solar technology or a household that relies on wind power, because it's cheaper to them, if you don't look at those subsidies, then we're not being honest about what the full costs are of these alternatives. So we've kind of talked about subsidies. I'm not going to say much more about it, but for those of you who are legislators in states and who are worried about your state government's budget, and who among you is not? What's that? Yeah? Okay, well, more power to you. If somebody's budget is in absolutely great shape, I'd like to pick my university up and move it there, because I can tell you in Arizona, our budget for this year, we're 40%, revenues are 40% short of expenditures, and you wouldn't want to touch prisons, so we're going to cut the universities and K through 12 education. And so when you talk about subsidies as a way to stimulate alternative technologies, one of the things that you have to think about is this going to make our budget problem more difficult, not less difficult? And when I finish, I'm going to talk about an economic incentive that I like because it has the potential both to address environmental problems that I think are serious ones, but also to generate some revenue for either the federal government or for state and local governments. So I've talked about subsidies. I want to talk about the second type of incentive-based approach. It's the most complicated to understand, but it's important because it's being used, or it's trying to be used. Congress is trying to do something like this at the federal level, and it's being used in some states. Incidentally, I'm now at about this point. This is right here in my talk. It's called cap and trade. Okay? And the idea behind a cap and trade approach is that we've got some environmental goal that we want to hit. We want to reduce emissions, say, by 30% over 1990 levels or 2000 levels or below where they are in 2010. And so the way we do it is to figure out okay, if we're emitting 10 tons now, or 10 million tons, whatever the number is, we want to reduce by 30%, we say, okay, the new goal is only 7. 7 tons, 7 million tons, whatever. A 30% reduction. So we say then, okay, that's all that can be emitted. Then the first challenge is, okay, how is it we go about affecting this reduction? Well, one thing you can do is you print up tickets. We'll call them allowances or emission reduction credits. So if it's 7 million, you print up 7 million tickets, and the idea is if you emit a ton of carbon dioxide or whatever the pollutant is, you've got to hold a ticket for it. So in order to make a system like this work, you've got to have a way of deciding what the goal is. You print the tickets. Then you've got to figure out, okay, well, how do we allocate these tickets? There are a couple ways you can do that. You could just auction them off. Now remember that people used to discharge 10 million. If you auction them off, things that they used to be able to discharge for free, now they have to pay for. So under this cap and trade system, Congress, no surprise to many people, has said, well, no, we're not going to auction them off. We're going to create an auction that says we'll maybe auction a little off, and we promise you in the future they'll all be auctioned off. But what they've said, for now, we're going to give them out to the people mostly who are currently discharging. So even though they're going to have to discharge less, we're not going to charge them up to the total amount of the cap, the new lower cap. Okay? Well, so where's the economic incentive there? You've told everybody they have to discharge less, and you've given them permits for 70% of what they used to discharge. Well, now the idea is, if some of these sources think, you know, we actually could reduce pollution pretty inexpensively, and if we do that, we hold permits for X amount, why don't we cut back? Then we've got some permits we can sell. Because some sources are going to go, holy cow, we've got to discharge 30% less. We can't do that. We better go buy some permits from people who have excess permits. And you've got some sellers, you've got some buyers, voila, you have a market. And through this cap and trade approach, you have put a price on pollution. Anybody who is a discharger always thinks, if I cut back, I've got something valuable to sell. And if you're a discharger, you now have fewer permits than you used to have, remember. We've reduced by 30%. If you can't find a way to operate with those fewer permits, you've got to go buy permits from somebody. And so there's a market for permits. We put a price on pollution. And all of a sudden, we've created an incentive for those who can reduce emissions inexpensively to cut back. Those who can't reduce inexpensively become buyers. And the great thing about this is, by creating this kind of market, all of the emission reductions take place among the sources that can cut back inexpensively. So we've actually minimized the cost to society of reducing emissions by creating a cap and trade program like this. Now, there are all kinds of administrative problems associated with doing this. You might think, how could we ever make this work? Well, we have an example in the United States of making a program like this work that actually has been, in my opinion, and I'm a little bit biased because the organization for which I worked for 33 years in Washington, I think, kept the idea of incentive-based approaches to environmental protection alive during a time when everybody laughed about it. But in 1990, Congress said, we've got to reduce sulfur dioxide emissions from coal-fired power plants. And they said, you know, we've been telling them what technology to use. Why should some DS-12 at EPA know what a steel plant or a coal-fired power plant could do to best and most inexpensively reduce pollution? Let's just give them an emission reduction, and we'll let these credits be bought and sold. So we got a faster reduction than the goal that was established in the legislation. It cost much less than was estimated. A huge success this SO2 trading program was. And that's why people have thought, okay, let's use it for carbon dioxide. I'm a proponent of doing that. It's a much harder problem for carbon dioxide because there are so many sources, okay? The other challenge with cap and trade is that if you give all of the permits away to start the process, as was the case under the Waxman-Markey bill and the Senate bill, everybody said, well, we're going to distribute these permits to sort of either pay off political friends or reduce the price increases that would come about if we made, say, a power plant bid for all of these emissions that they used to have for free. Understandable, as a way to keep rates down, they give the permits away. So you've created a market and you create a powerful incentive for people to reduce pollution, but you haven't generated any revenue. And that leads to the third type of incentive-based approach, which is a tax on pollution. Now, I know you state legislators, when you hear that, you go like this, a tax. Bear with me for just a second. I'm going to describe how I think this would work and then conclude, and I'm actually fairly close to concluding because I want to give you an opportunity to ask questions and I want to preserve time for those who follow me. I'm going to suggest why I think the time may be right for a tax on the carbon content of fuels, not because people think that carbon dioxide is a serious environmental problem that will give our kids a less habitable world to be in, though I take that problem seriously. I think it's a much better way to raise revenue than to tax labor and capital, which we want to encourage in the United States. We want people to work hard and save, but that's where we raise a lot of money now, from taxes on labor and capital. So let me say just a word or two about how a carbon tax would work. Basically, the tax could be right down at the consumer level, where when you gas up your pump, somebody figures out how many tons of CO2 is going to be discharged, and you pay a tax then. When you buy something at the store, if there's carbon emissions related from using the product, you could pay a tax then. This is a cockamamie way to do it. The easiest way to levy a carbon tax is way upstream on the people who produce oil and gas or the people who mine coal. And when it's produced, they have to pay a tax on the carbon content of that fuel. That then gets reflected in electricity prices, in gasoline prices, in natural gas prices, in chemical prices, etc. And no one likes the fact that that will make prices higher. Just remember that a cap and trade program will do the very same thing. It's sort of a tax in sheep's clothing, to return to the theme of my joke to start the talk. That's exactly what cap and trade proposals are designed to do, is to increase the price of fossil fuels. That's the way it's going to reduce emissions. And so in a carbon tax, we're open and honest and explicit about it. And we say, okay, it's going to be a $10 a ton tax on every ton of carbon discharged into the atmosphere. Prices go up. Do we need a way to monitor? Sure. But the farther upstream you levy this tax on oil and gas production, we know upstream how much is produced. What about a power plant that installs carbon capture and sequestration? They would have paid a tax on the coal, but they're not actually emitting CO2. There has to be a system whereby if you take steps to reduce carbon emissions, then you get credit for that. It's like a tax deduction. And those have to be just as verifiable as taking a mortgage interest deduction or some other deduction in the tax code. After all, what we're trying to discourage is not necessarily oil and gas production or coal, it's carbon emissions. So that if we can use those things in a way that doesn't produce carbon, they need to get a credit for that. Okay? And, of course, as with any tax, the government collects the revenues. Now, some people who are proponents of a carbon tax say, let's take all the money and put it into clean technologies. Well, that's one of the things that you could do with the money. There's no question about that. Other people say, let's take the revenues and use it to help communities that are hard hit by a carbon tax. coal mining communities or oil and gas communities. You could do that too. The one thing I know for sure is the government needs more revenues. The last time I looked at the federal level, the deficit for this year is $1.4 trillion. We're going to cut that. We better cut it in part by big reductions in expenditures. We simply have to do that. We can't just keep layering more taxes on more taxes on more taxes. Of course we have to cut expenditures. But you know, guys, I'm going to turn 65 years old in a little more than 3 months. I'm about to go register for Medicare. So the next time I have to go to the hospital, which is a long time, God forbid, my University of Arizona health insurance is going to pay for the first part, and all of the rest of us are going to pay through whatever's left through Medicare. And there are plenty of people. I'm at the cutting edge of the baby boom generation, and all of those people behind me are going to start collecting Social Security and Medicare. Are we going to have to reduce the generosity of those benefits? In my opinion, yes. We're going to have to cut federal spending in other ways to deal with the deficit, but we have to have more revenues. And so if you think about it now, okay, we're going to cut spending, we want more revenues. Are we going to tax labor supply? Well, that we do that now. Do we want to add to that burden and further discourage people from starting new businesses, making more money? I don't think that's a good idea. Are we going to tax dividends more from people who save and invest? I don't think that's such a great idea either. Okay, if we have to raise more revenues, if you don't believe that we can accomplish all of this through expenditure reduction, some of you may. I don't think we'll ever get there, but if you believe that we have to raise some additional revenues, why don't we tax something that we want to discourage rather than something that we want to encourage? And the truth is that a carbon tax does that most explicitly. A cap and trade program where you auctioned off all the permits would do the same thing, but I don't think that any politicians can resist the allure of handing out those permits free of charge and thus depriving the government of a revenue source to pay for all the things that we want: agricultural subsidies, national defense, Medicare, Social Security, all the investments that somebody demands but that none of us want to pay for. And that's the idea behind incentive-based approaches. You both address an environmental problem that, in my opinion, is a serious problem that we have to begin to do something about, and at the same time, you come up with a source of revenues that doesn't discourage something that we need more, not less of. This is admittedly a very quick trip through things that are complicated, and I've oversimplified, but I hope that you get the idea of how these incentive-based approaches differ from traditional command and control regulation, from voluntary approaches, from the kind of public-private partnerships that John talked about, why they have played a role in the environmental arsenal in the United States, and why there's so much interest globally in making use of these things in Europe, in other parts of the world where they think that they need to reduce carbon emissions. They're going down this cap and trade route, which, as I said, is effectively a carbon tax in sheep's clothing, though in some ways may be the politically easiest way to do this. So I apologize for skirting details that are complicated, but I'm going to stop here in the hopes that you have some questions, and thank you for the attention that you've shown me. I appreciate it.